Hi everyone. Today we are going to be talking about writing strong sentences. So let's go ahead and get into it. This is what our agenda looks like. We're going to talk about the importance of writing concisely, avoiding ambiguity and cliches, varying sentence length, using parallel structure, and last but not least, using active voice. So first and foremost, why writing strong sentences is important. First and foremost, strong sentences just make for a better, more academic paper, right? The better the sentence, the better it sounds. That's pretty straightforward, right? It also encourages reader engagement. So if you're reading something that is extremely boring, you probably are not going to be very engaged, right? And the whole point of this class is learning how to write essays or how to write persuasively, how to make a persuasive argument, meaning you are trying to persuade your reader to either believe something or do something or see your point of view. And if your reader's not engaged, they probably are not going to be super invested in what it is you're trying to argue to them. So that's another reason writing strong sentences is very important. It also just sounds professional, right? When we follow a certain sentence structure, it sounds academic, it sounds professional, which we of course want to do in an academic setting. Last but not least, it helps your paper structure flow, right? There are certain ways to help avoid your writing sound kind of like robotic or chunky in a way. And when we use a certain sentence structure, writing strong sentences, it gives your paper like a nice rhythm, a nice flow, which is super important. So first and foremost, we're talking about writing concisely. What does that mean? First, there's this misconception that college writing should sound, very academic and use complex, confusing language. But that is not really the case all the time. Effective academic writing is concise. Every single word counts. For all of your essays this semester, you're going to have a writing minimum, a word count minimum, and a word count maximum, right? Believe it or not, a lot of people really do have, really struggle not going beyond the maximum word count because it's easy for us to ramble. And that's something that we want to fix this semester. That's something we want to focus on when trying to improve our writing, is making sure that we use writing concisely, that we make sure every word counts, right? You should have a distinct and useful purpose for every single word in every essay, in every sentence. Every single word should have a purpose. It's important to remove any kind of fluff. You should get straight to the point, say what you mean, and say it quick. There's no reason to beat around the bush. Be plain and direct, be concise, okay? So how do we know if we're being concise? These are some questions for you to ask yourself. Am I spending my reader's time wisely? Yes or no? Am I using unnecessary, complex, and confusing language? Yes or no? Could I say the same thing in 5 words rather than 50 words, rather than in 500 words, right? Could I say the same thing in a shorter sentence than I am doing right now, okay? Longer is not always better, okay? A little bit more about writing concisely, specifically with word count. It is so easy to fall into the trap of the word count, right? You're writing your essay, you're writing your discussion post, and you're like, I don't have anything else to say, so I'm going to just start rambling. You do not want to do that, okay? Experienced readers will see straight through it. And I will tell you, I have written and read countless essays in my academic career, right? So I am an experienced reader. So if I'm reading your essay, it'll be very apparent to me when you start kind of just rambling because you don't have anything else to say. So try to avoid that. If you are struggling to meet the word count, rather than expand on what you have already said in your essay or kind of just like repeating the same thing over and over again, add more examples, use more quotations from the text you're citing, right? Incorporate new details. New things is important. New is the key word here. Don't try to expand on what you've already said by repeating the same thing over and over again in new ways. Add things that are new. When you do this, when we avoid fluffy and flowery language, it's easier for your reader to understand what it is you're trying to argue. When we have this excess language in our writing, it really often distracts our reader from what we're actually trying to say. And remember, in this class, you are trying to persuade your reader to think, believe, or do something. And so if you're distracting them from what it is you're actually trying to say, it's counterintuitive. It's the exact opposite of what you want to do. So writing concisely is extremely important. Here's a couple examples. So, cats have a tendency towards sleeping most of the day. That's a weird sentence. It makes sense. You understand what it's trying to say, but it's extremely wordy and just weird. How we could say this in a more concise manner is something like this. Cats usually sleep most of the day. It's saying exactly the same thing the first sentence said, just in a more concise manner. It's easier to understand. It's not wasting the reader's time. More concise. On the 12th day of the month of April. That is a weird sentence. Again, we understand what it's trying to say, but it's strange, right? How can we say this differently? On April 12th, straightforward, it's saying the exact same thing as the first sentence, but in a more concise manner. It's easier to understand, using your reader's time more wisely. Yeah? Redundancies. Avoid creating phrases using multiple words that mean the same thing. So this is kind of difficult because in our everyday language, we are extremely redundant, right? So these examples that I have here are phrases that we use probably pretty consistently. Look at the first example, positive benefits. One of these words is redundant. Which one do you think it is? Pause for a second. Take a look at these examples and see if you can figure out which of these words we can remove to avoid being redundant. Hopefully you paused. If you didn't, sorry for the awkward silence, the awkward pause, but positive benefits. We can remove the word positive because the word benefits already means positive, right? There are no negative benefits. The word benefit means something good. So by adding positive before that, it's redundant, it's completely unnecessary. By removing it, we become more concise. The second example, join together. We can remove together because the word join means to put things together, right? So we don't need the word together. It already means the same thing. Next one, completely surrounded. We do not need the word completely because in order to be surrounded by something, that means you are completely surrounded, right? If there's space on one side of you, that means you're not surrounded. Surrounded means all sides. So the word completely is redundant. We don't need it. Gather together. Again, we don't need together because when we gather, we come together. That's what the word means, right? So the word together is redundant. We don't need it. Last but not least, clearly articulate. We do not need the word clearly because the word articulate means to explain something clearly. So the word clearly is already ingrained in the word articulate, so we don't need it. It's redundant. By removing it, we make our writing more concise. All right, so let's talk about cliches. So a cliche is a phrase or expression or idea that's been overused to the point of losing its original impact. They're predictable, they're extremely unoriginal, stale, and honestly just kind of uninspiring. These are phrases that we hear all the time. They are ingrained into our language. So avoiding cliches in your writing is often kind of difficult because sometimes we use them without even knowing that they are cliches. Again, because they are so ingrained in what we say very frequently. The biggest issue with cliches is that they are not your own words, right? You want your writing to be original. You want your writing to be yours. And so when we incorporate cliches, it's not plagiarism by any means, but it just is not your own words. It's unoriginal. And so it doesn't have a lot of impact. They don't have a lot of impact. These are a few examples of cliches that we hear very frequently, like plain as day. What does that mean? Plain as day. Like when you really think about that statement, what does it mean? I don't know, ballpark figure. Again, what does that mean? At the end of the day, it's a little more understandable, but again, it's predictable, it's unoriginal, it's uninspiring. You don't want to use phrases like that. Thinking outside the box, read between the lines. Again, all cliches. If you do use cliches, it's not the end of the world. It's not something you're going to fail a paper for, but your paper will be so much better without them, so try your best to avoid them. Okay? Next, we're moving on to varying sentence length, okay? When you vary sentence lengths, that enhances the readability and effectiveness of your writing, okay? Long sentences can convey something that is very complex, very nuanced, something that needs like a long, detailed explanation, and that's great. Short sentences, on the other hand, can emphasize key points or create a sense of urgency. Both long sentences and short sentences are very important. I think sometimes in academic reading, and this kind of goes back to the idea that when we write, we have to sound very academic and very proper, whatever that means. And so we tend to think longer is better, but that's not always the case. All of your sentences shouldn't be super long. You should have long and short varying, right? And this variation ends up adding rhythm and flow, okay? It makes it more interesting for your reader to sit down and read. Not all sentences should be short. This creates a choppy, robotic sounding kind of writing. And like I said before, not all sentences should be long. This creates confusing, overdrawn arguments, and we don't want our readers feeling confused, right? We are trying to convince or persuade our reader of something, and so if they're confused, they are certainly not being persuaded. So we want to make sure that we have these varying sentence lengths. So go ahead and pause this video and read this paragraph and take a look at the different sentence lengths, right? You have some very long sentences, and you'll notice that the sentences that are long are very detailed. It's important that they're long because the idea that it's trying to convey contains a lot of details, right? You'll also notice these short sentences, right? The short sentences are very powerful. They get straight to the point. They convey some kind of powerful idea, right? So again, pause this for a moment and go ahead and read and notice the different sentence lengths, okay? Moving on to parallel structure. Parallel structure is probably something that you've never heard of before, but it's very important that we're using this in our writing every single day, okay? So using parallel structure is using the same patterns to provide balance to sentences and paragraphs. This improves writing style and readability, so it sounds better and it's more readable, more easily understandable, right? It makes sentences easier to process. So for example, Yara loves running, to swim, and then biking. Makes sense, we understand what it's saying, but the way that it's structured is kind of chunky, right? It doesn't necessarily just like roll off the tongue. If we changed it to either one of these are using parallel structures. Yara loves running, swimming, and biking. These are now using gerunds, okay? G-E-R-U-N-D. Those are verbs ending in ing. So running, swimming, and biking. Parallel structure. Each verb is a gerund, so there's like a cohesiveness to the sentence now. It rolls off the tongue easier. Or Yara loves to run, to swim, and to bike, okay? So now all these verbs are using the infinitive form. To run, to swim, to bike. Compare these two to the very first example. Again, all three are saying the exact same thing, just the last two are using parallel structure, which makes it just all around a better sentence, easier to understand, right? So take a look at these examples. The dog ran across the yard and jumped over the fence, and down the alley he sprinted. We understand what it's trying to say. We understand all the things that the dog did, but it's confusing. Instead, if we changed it to the dog ran across the yard, jumped over the fence, and sprinted down the alley, we see how it's now using parallel structure. It's now very cohesive. It's not jumping around in the way that verbs are being used. It's utilizing parallel structure. It's easier to understand. It sounds better, and it's just easier to read in general. All right, last but not least, we're going to talk about using active voice. So when we're writing, it's best to use active verbs, okay? So what does this mean? This means that when we write, it's important for us to emphasize a person or a thing that's doing something rather than a person or thing having something done to it, okay? That may sound kind of confusing, like when explained out loud, but look at these examples. So the outfielder threw the ball, okay? This sentence is saying that this person is doing something, okay? The next example is saying the ball was thrown by the outfielder. Rather than emphasizing the person or thing doing something, like the first example, this is now emphasizing a person or thing having something done to it. The ball was thrown by the outfielder. The ball had this done to it. So that is passive voice. We want to use active voice, so following the first example. This person did this rather than this person or thing had something done to it. This next example, Beyonce sings the song Single Ladies. This is active voice. Beyonce is a person doing this thing. Rather than this last example, Single Ladies is sung by Beyonce. This song is being sung by this person, right? That is passive voice. The first example is active voice. The last is passive voice, okay? So again, it's very important for us to use active voice in academic writing. This is something that I would say for the most part we do naturally, but we also very frequently write in passive voice. So when we're proofreading, this is something that you want to kind of like add to your checklist of things to look for. Am I consistently writing in active voice? I will say this is something that I struggle with sometimes, right? It's very easy to kind of flip into passive voice. So it's something to intentionally, consciously be aware of when we're writing, when we're proofreading what we've already written, okay? A formula to kind of follow is A does B, not B is done by A. So if you're like a math person who likes, formulas, that's kind of how your brain works. That is the formula for active voice that you want to follow. A does B, not B is done by A. Passive voice, when we write in passive voice, it very often masks the source of the action or the who in the sentence that's doing something, which can very easily make a sentence unclear. So for example, I've been hit. That doesn't say who hit you. That doesn't say what hit you. It just says that you have been hit, right? Rather, we could say a paintball hit me in the arm. Then we are using active voice. The source of the action is no longer masked, right? We know what hit you. A paintball hit you, right? I've been hit. There's nothing grammatically incorrect about it. It just would be a stronger sentence if it was written in active voice. It gives a little bit more information. This last example, taxes will be collected according to local law. Again, it doesn't say who is collecting the taxes. It's just saying taxes will have this thing done to it. It will be collected. Instead, we could write government officials will collect taxes according to local law. Now we know who is doing the action, right? That's important. Is a sentence should emphasize the who or the what is doing the action. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, this is something that we do naturally in our writing, but it's not difficult in any way, shape, or form to write in passive voice. So be aware of it, understand this concept, and if you have any questions, of course, as always, please let me know. That is it for writing strong sentences. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you guys next time.